Dr. Ankur Kakkar received his doctorate degree in history from the South Asia Institute, University of Heidelberg, Germany. His doctoral dissertation entitled The Dayanand Anglo-Vedic School of Lahore, a study of education reform in colonial Punjab 1880 to 1920, was supervised by Professor Geeta Dharampal, daughter of eminent historian Sri Dharampal. Dr. Ankur Kakkar is presently a fellow at the Prime Minister's Museum and Library in New Delhi, where he is working on the research topic titled Rethinking Nationalist Education, a study of indigenous enterprises 1880 to 1980. Dr. Kakkar has served as an associate professor at the Center for Indic Studies, Indus University, Ahmedabad, where he has taught core and elective courses on various aspects of Indian knowledge systems. His recent monograph titled Land of Pathshalas, published by Blue Ink, New Delhi, provides a comprehensive overview of indigenous Indian education in the 19th century. His topic for webinar today is Pathshalas in Pre-Colonial India, the Untold Story of Math Education in the 19th Century. In this talk, Dr. Ankur Kakkar will share insights from his book, Land of Pathshalas, Exploring 19th Century Indian Education and Challenging Colonial-Era Assumptions with fresh evidence from his research. We will hear about what was education like in India before the British rule? Did all communities have access to learning? How was math used in daily life? And thank you, Dr. Ankur, again for giving us insights not only in the education in the pre-colonial India, but also focusing on math education, which is one of our interests. Not that we're not interested in other education, but we really like math education, to hear about the math education. So thank you, Dr. Ankur. Over to you.
Namaste, everyone. Welcome to this wonderful session being organized by IAVM. And let me begin first by thanking Swati Daveji and Gauriji and the directors of IAVM for giving me this opportunity to present my work before all of you here today. The topic for today's discussion is the land of Pathshalas and especially the tradition of Indian Pathshalas in the pre-colonial period. So we all have heard about Indian education, and when we first ask about what is education, what is Indian education, we are often confronted with so many different kinds of opinions and notions about what education was like in the pre-colonial period. But very few of us get down to the facts and the hardcore evidence about what really education was like, how many pathshalas were there, what was taught in these pathshalas, what was the curriculum of these pathshalas, what was the learning and teaching methods, the pedagogy of these pathshalas. So when I use the word pathshalas, I am referring broadly to the entire system of institutions that existed and still continue to exist to a certain extent in India before the British introduced the modern British colonial system of education. So before the advent of the modern universities and colleges, what was the style of education? What was the functioning of education? How was knowledge transmitted in India before the British came? That is the primary question that this talk will deal with. And also parallelly how mathematics was taught and how what were the different kinds of mathematics lessons that were learned is also something we will throw light on in this talk. So broadly, this talk will be structured in the way that we will try to cover a wide range of issues, and also try in the process we will shatter some myths, or I should say some notions that we have, some preconceived notions about our pre-colonial Indian education system. So to begin with, the first myth that is widely prevalent is that and especially after the 19th century, was that just like the British gave us the modern systems like parliamentary democracy, roads, railways, and constitution, and so on. So they also gave us the education system, the English education system, or also known as the British colonial education system, which consists of all these modern universities and colleges that were set up after 1854. So all these Delhi University and Madras University, Bombay University, Calcutta universities, all these central universities were set up, and all these schools and colleges were recognized, and a whole education department was established to supervise this educational structure. So all of this was established by the British. We know all this. But what we take for granted is the fact that this system was uh, somehow it was a blessing for India, and because we did not have something like that before. Now, this is a myth that was propagated by the colonial machinery during the colonial period, especially in the 19th century, and also some in the 20th century. So, my book that this talk is based on, my book titled Land of Pathshalas, which you can see on your screen. I'll share the cover image of the book just for your convenience, and then you can have a look at it. Uh, so this is just allow me a second. Let me just open it. Can you see it now on the screen?
Yes, Ankur, we can.
So this is a cover image of my book titled Land of Pathshalas, and this book covers the story of indigenous Indian education or pre-colonial Indian education, especially in the late 18th and early 19th century, covering the tradition of Indian knowledge transmission that was native to India before the British introduced their colonial system of education. This is the whole idea of the book. Okay. So if you all can have a look at the book. You can get your copy on Amazon India, and um, uh, otherwise also we can try to distribute some copies. So now coming back to the discussion on this topic, uh, the first question was that was there any kind of Indian education system or any kind of systematic institutional structure that existed in India, which was meant for knowledge transmission? That was the first question, because the first allegation, or the first you can say this whole attack on Indian civilization and culture in the colonial period by the British uh, imperialists, I would say, and also some missionaries, was that because India does not have any pre-existing systematic structures meant for knowledge transmission, so therefore it is imperative for us to introduce English education, and therefore it is imperative that India should have a new system of education which will ensure that a lot of people, most of the people, become educated and literate. Now, how did this, originate, and why was this a myth propagated so much? This is the first question I'll explore. So, in order to answer this question, I will briefly explain to you why this was the case. So, now what happened was that uh, the British, when they started surveying when they came to India, they started surveying. They started conducting some surveys on the ways in which Indians were educating themselves, on various kinds of indigenous institutions. And in their surveys and in their investigations, they prepared a questionnaire, and on the basis of the results that they found in these surveys, then they took further course of action. Now the problem was that this whole survey and this whole investigation was done, and it brought out about a wide range of facts and figures. But the British selectively represented the data from these findings to prove that India did not have a systematic indigenous education system. So, first of all, the framework was set up in a way that it would justify the introduction of English or British education, and it would paint a bleak picture of indigenous Indian education. So, for example, when they were asking for the overall literacy rate or the number of women who are students who are enrolled in schools and colleges, or when they were asking questions like was there a regular system of attendance or regular mechanism for fees and a systematic arrangement for these questions, they got a wide variety of inputs and data and results, but they selectively represented it and painted a bleak picture of the indigenous educational institutions in order to justify their own imposition of British colonial institutions. So of course, this framework was prepared, and then the data was presented in a way to further show that how important it is for the British to reform Indian education and therefore to intervene and establish a new structure for education. Now, this narrative and this whole narrative about Indian education, about the structure pre-existing education institutions, was first challenged in 1983 by the publication of Dharampalji's Beautiful Tree. Sri Dharampal, he was a historian who worked largely in the British archives in London. So what he did was in 1983, he brought out this book titled The Beautiful Tree. The Beautiful Tree is based on a phrase that was adopted from Gandhi's speech in 1931. So in 1931, Gandhi delivered a speech titled in which he used this phrase, the beautiful tree, and he said that Indian education system was like a beautiful tree, and the British, they scratched the soil and then they rooted, and then this beautiful tree perished, and somehow India was more educated before the British. So, on Gandhi's instigation, Dharampal wanted to find out if it was true. So, in London, he started doing a lot of archival work. And at the British Library in London, there were all these archives and all these original surveys and documents and reports that were prepared in the 19th century when the British were conducting these surveys on Indian indigenous education, or you can say pre-colonial or native education, as they used to call it. And what Dharampalji found was that when he accessed these original surveys again and examined them, he found a completely contradictory picture to what the British would have us believe. So what Dharampalji found in the surveys of the British themselves was a very fascinating set of details regarding these indigenous institutions. For example, Dharampalji found that in almost all the villages there was a Pathshala. Pathshala means like a basic school where children learn the basics of numeracy, account keeping, reading, writing, and also their cultural education. So this was a widespread network of common institutions, common Pathshalas. And interestingly, what Dharampalji also found was that most of these pathshalas were functioned and sustained by the villages and local communities themselves. So the funding was not done by any central board or central agency. Rather, these were self-governed institutions that formed part of the organic uh, economy of the village and governance of the village community. So they were self-reliant institutions. Another interesting feature of these indigenous institutions that came out from these surveys was that these institutions were open to all classes and all social backgrounds. So all students, their caste wise, details are mentioned, and same for the teachers of these institutions. So these were some of the interesting features and details that emerged from these historical surveys of the 19th century. And the picture that then came out after Dharampalji's book was a completely in contradiction to what the British would have us believe, that India was not educated or not literate before the British somehow gave us a blessing of Indian English education. So, based on Dharampalji's work, I started my own quest and my own journey to find out the true nature of indigenous Indian education or pre-colonial education. And following in Dharampalji's footsteps, I started looking at more surveys and more records from various other provinces that were not covered in Dharampalji's book. So Dharampalji's book was focused more specifically on the Madras Presidency area, the southern part of India, whereas I have expanded the scope of the investigations and looked at similar patterns that existed in these records for other provinces covering the western part of India, that was the erstwhile Bombay presidency, then the Punjab area, and then the northwestern provinces, which is currently Uttar Pradesh area in India, and then also the eastern part of India, which includes Bengal, Bihar, Odisha, these states in modern India. So the geographical extent and the whole scope of the Pathshalas that I found from my research was quite fascinating, because in almost every province, all the records revealed the same pattern, that there was a widespread network of Pathshalas, almost one Pathshala in every village, and also there was a very large variety of skills and knowledge systems that were transmitted. Now, this was a very important turning point. And following this, it led me to ask a different set of questions. So when I started conducted more investigations and went for field work, we developed a different framework, and that framework was different from what the colonial surveys uh, would have. So my book has over 20 maps which show this pattern of a high incidence of Pathshalas at both the elementary and advanced levels, a widespread distribution of students and teachers across social backgrounds, a structured curriculum, and a systematic method of funding. So this was something that we found across when we interpreted these surveys and analyzed this data. Another interesting feature that we found when we analyzed the data was that women were quite actively engaged in many occupations and many industries in the pre-colonial period, or even in the colonial period, for as a matter of fact, especially in the industrial arts and crafts, and also in industries such as cotton spinning and weaving. So most of the people who formed, uh, women formed the overwhelming majority of the occupations in cotton spinning and weaving, and arts and crafts in music and dance. So this completely contradicted the notion or the myth that women were not educated in the pre-colonial period, or that it was only after the British that female literacy started rising. Of course, literacy was not prevalent in the form that they couldn't read or write, but uh, they were well equipped to perform their function in society. So if that is a parameter of education, one would certainly call them highly educated. So that was one thing we found quite interesting. And the reason that these women or these institutions did not figure in the British reports or surveys was that because they were not formal institutions. So that was another interesting feature we found from our analysis of data, was that indigenous Indian education was highly decentralized. So there, it was not like a central agency or a board that would decide the curriculum, but rather the institutions were local, organic, and decentralized. So knowledge transmission was very it was decentralized in the sense that it could be available in any avenue. Uh, a family home could function as an institution of knowledge transmission, as has been documented by George Birdwood in his two-volume work titled Industrial Arts and Crafts of India, in which he says that every home was like a nursery of the beautiful, and how knowledge would be transmitted in arts and crafts from mother to daughter, and how it was done in the family. And not just a family home, there were other kinds of institutions that were available for knowledge transmission, like temples, mutts, and pathshalas, of course. But every form of dance and drama was also a medium of education. So therefore, the methods of popular education were widely available, and a wide variety of avenues was available. And that is the reason that that these institutions or these educational mechanisms did not figure in the British reports, because they did not bother to look for these kind of institutions. And that's why the picture that emerged from the British reports was that uh, India was probably not very educated. But when one analyzes the records from a cultural perspective, one or indigenous point of view, one realizes that it was not the case. India was actually highly educated, and a wide variety of skills were being transmitted. In fact, what one realizes is that India has been a knowledge centered civilization. And not only were the 14 classical disciplines, which we call as the Chaturdash Vidyasthan, consisting of the Ved and the Mimamsa tradition, Nyaya, Dharma Shastra, and various other classical disciplines, not only were they taught, but also the tradition of 64 arts, or 64 kalas as they are called, was also transmitted in various kinds of institutions. So that was another myth that we tried to uh, debunk in our work. And another thing was that when we prepared this framework, of going beyond the colonial framework of asking these questions, this took us to the works of great luminaries, such as Sri Aurobindo, Sri Dharampal ji, Sri Ram Swarup ji, Kapila Vatsyayan, Anand Kumaraswamy, Anand Wood. All of them explained the fundamentals of the Indian tradition, and that helped us to develop a framework for understanding indigenous Indian education. So what we did was we developed some questions, and so based on this, the framework was developed. And the questions that I asked during my fieldwork was, what were the different kinds of Indian knowledge traditions and practices? What was the importance of education and knowledge transmission in India? What was the way in which different sections were educating their children? What was the Indian method of pedagogy? And what were the aims? So such questions have been asked, and I have provided an answer to these questions in my book. In doing so, I have tried to explain how the Indic framework and methodology of education based on yoga and dharma keeps getting reflected across all the different kinds of disciplines and knowledge traditions that we have discussed in the book. For instance, we find that in the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, there is a mention of the five yam, panch niyam, and five niyam, panch niyam. So yam is the inner vows, you can say like that, and niyam is the outer rules of conduct. So we saw that in all the pathshalas, these yam and niyam were being practiced and taught in different forms, in different forms. So the five yam are inner vows are ahimsa, satya, asteya, brahmacharya, and aparigraha. These are very well known. And similarly, the five niyams are shauch, santosh, tap, swadhyaya, and ishwar pranidhan. All these were formed an integral part of the pedagogy that was adopted or being practiced in the various pathshalas that were prevalent in the pre-colonial period. This shows that the aim of Indian education was not just the acquisition of information or knowledge from texts, but also the development of the inner dimension of the personality. So, the inner and outer dimensions of the personality both were important for Indian education. And we found this in almost all the data that we surveyed. And it helps us understand also that there was an emphasis on dharma shiksha, which was ethical or religious instruction. It can be loosely translated as ethical and religious instruction. So this was a common feature across all pathshalas. They all placed emphasis on how to teach and impart social, political, and individual ethics to the student, so that when he graduates, he becomes a practitioner of the tradition. He is not just a knowledge, he doesn't have a knowledge just of the tradition or the expertise of the skill, but also he is able to conduct himself in a righteous manner in social, political, and in his personal life. So, therefore, we talk a lot about character development and ethical education or moral education today. But This was a very integral part of the education system in India since millennia. We have so many texts talking about it, right from the Manusmriti that says that acharah paramo dharmaha, and then it says further that the whole objective of education is to make sure that the student is able to conduct himself in a righteous manner. So achar or acharya is very important because that was an integral part of the education system. Now, the reason I'm saying all this is that I want to highlight the fact that when we ask these questions from a decolonized framework, we get a very different picture of Indian education system that was prevalent in the pre-colonial period. And yeah, so it helps us break a lot of myths about indigenous education. And I have a lot of maps that are there in the book that I can yeah. Now coming to the second part of this book, of this talk, which is on how mathematics was taught and how what were the different kinds of mathematics that was education that was imparted. So one of the first things that we learn from these accounts and from this research work is that in the common Pathshalas, the arithmetic was taught mostly mentally or orally. So it was a mental arithmetic, not a written sort of arithmetic, and it was practical to the extent that it was the purpose of teaching mathematics was very practical. It was not theoretical. So in the sense that you would not the student would not be expected to memorize formulae or memorize equations, learn algebraic equations, or memorize calculus just for the sake of it. Rather, the student would be taught particular transactions, particular accounts, particular mathematical lessons that would have a practical value in his day-to-day life for his transactions. So for example, we have that young boys could perform multiplications up to 20 times 20, or even children as young as 10 would have memorized tables up to 100 times 3 by 4, which is very difficult because unless you have a very high mental training. Now, why this was the case was because most of these transactions had to be done in these units. So they had to learn, memorize tables and fractions, and those particular fractions that were relevant for them in their day-to-day lives. And then also in account keeping, because account keeping was something that was relevant and fundamental to almost every occupation that was common in that time. So this is something we learn from our surveys. And when we talk about mathematics lessons, we learn that it was all these lessons were quite practical because they were only taught the only those units and weights and measurements were taught that were useful and relevant for them in their day-to-day lives. For example, a farmer would be taught the measurements of land, and according to that, the mathematics would be taught. Similarly, for somebody who's a trader or a merchant, he would learn in a different manner. So it was very deeply connected with the occupation and the day-to-day life. The practical value of the education was considered and was imparted in that way. Today we have students who graduate and maybe they have learned a lot of maths in their schools, but they can't perform simple, practical calculations when it comes to, practical day-to-day transactions. So this was something that we found out was a unique feature of mathematics education. Also, in the higher teaching of mathematics, it was also practical. One good example of this is, for example, you may be aware about this also. Uh, the value of pi, for example, it has been established that many of the Indian mathematicians had arrived at the value of pi long before we had the discovery of value of pi in the Western world by great mathematicians. Now, how was this possible? This was possible because of the again the practical application or the need for such knowledge. So there was a need for squaring the circle, and this question of how to square the circle arose from the need to have equal areas for the Vedi. So the Vedi is a structure that is has to be established for the performance of a Vedic ritual, or the Agni ritual, okay, or the Yagya. Now there are two ways, primary ways in which you can do this ritual. One way is to have a circle that represents the heaven, and that is a symbolic ritual, and then you have to, perform that ritual accordingly. The other way is to have a square Vedi that represents the four ends of the earth. So that is again symbolic of the earth. And in some cases, you need both. But for that, the area of the circle and the square has to be equal. Now, this question of how to make the area of the square equal to the area of the circle gave rise to the problem of how to approximate. So they realize that they can't equal the area, because you can never square a circle equally or exactly, and you can only do it approximately. And when they started figuring this out geometrically, they realized and came to the value of pi. Pi is equal to, as you all know, is 3.14, but it's only an approximate value. And this factor of pi arose out of the need for squaring the circle. So Indian mathematicians were able to discover the value of pi and do this construction of the square and circle with approximate equal area long before we had Western discovery of value of pi. And similarly, also for the Pythagoras theorem, we know that Pythagoras theorem says that in a right angle triangle, the square of the hypotenuse will be equal to square of the sides. But this was again mentioned already in the Sulva Sutras of Bodhayan long before we had this Pythagoras theorem. So Indian mathematicians did not give such theorems in the form of just theoretical, for theoretical purposes, but to solve a practical problem. And that nature of Indian mathematics is something that also became then an integral feature of the Indian way of teaching mathematics, and also in schools and colleges, in the schools, elementary schools of the pre-colonial period. So, keeping this in mind, the research in this book shows how there was a wide variety of lessons that was taught in these schools, and therefore it shatters many myths about our pre-existing structures and indigenous institutions that were prevalent in India. So that's all that I would like to say as of now. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ankur, Dr. Ankur. And this was fascinating insight into the land of Pathshalas, where we come from. Dr. Ankur, please meet James Glover, who is the chair of IAVM.
Hi.
James,
Hi.
James, you did miss the earlier part. I met Ankur during the conference last year when Gauri and I went to Ujjain. And at that time, I think, Dr. Ankur, your presentation was on the skill-based education that was transmitted through the families, right? If I'm
Right, right,
correct?
right.
Yeah. And
Yes,
that
yes.
was a fascinating insight into what you were talking right now is how the knowledge transmission happened within the families itself, for like the sculptors, the weavers, the dancers, and which was an informal education, but a very strong foundation of learning.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. And if you remember, Dr. Ankur, my presentation at that time was also on the mathematical education of the nice schools, which did talk about the pathshalas and how the math was taught orally and
Yeah.
everything that you were talking about.
Mhm.
So thank you so much, but for us, for giving a broader view and bringing us to this whole discussion. I cannot wait to read your book, which is with Gauri and coming to me in next week. So would definitely be interested to learn more about it. And over to James, and then Prajakti. Prajakti Gokhale is also one of our directors. She'll give a vote of thanks. So James, if yeah, go ahead.
Oh, um, Dr. Kakkar, thank you so much. I do have a question or two. Um, your description of these surveys by the British in the different states in India.
Yeah.
Can you say what was the initial inspiration for them to conduct such surveys? Why would they bother?
Yes, yes. Yes, that's a good question, and we all, are very curious to know about this. So the first inspiration was quite administrative in nature, because these surveys were part of the larger administrative inquiries when they had to administer a particular uh, district. So they had to gather all the information that was required for governance of that district. So this information included information also on, you had to know the number of schools, you had to know the number of the population, the male population, and also the male population that was going to school and that was not going to school. Also to know about how to, engage them, and how what area is there, because a lot of these schools, they were also receiving revenue assignments. So the British had to know that how much rent of or rent free land is being given and or was previously being given. So, because schools were part of the socio-economic structure that was pre-existing, so they, for the administrative purposes, they had to gather as much information as possible about all kinds of institutions. And then they also had a lot of pressure from the East India Company to introduce or to intervene in the field of education, which initially they were not interested in doing. But then they thought that, okay, a lot of data should be presented to us before we should know whether we really need to intervene in the field of education. So that was also an initial inspiration to understand whether British intervention is required. And interestingly, the first survey, which was conducted in Madras Presidency by Governor Thomas Munro at that time,
Moderate.
was that actually Thomas Munro, when he conducted these investigations and when the results came to him, he came to the conclusion that there was no need for British intervention, because already there was a pre-existing large pre-existing structure and a vast network of Pathshalas. And therefore, all that we needed to do was for the British to actually support these Pathshalas and to, make sure that they receive, the teachers are receiving their, you know, they are being well paid, or I mean they're doing okay, and then the arrangements are fine. And so initially the first surveys were actually quite seemed to be quite benign, because they were only interested in gathering data and gathering more information. And it was only after 1835, that was when the English Education Act was passed by the Bentinck administration under when Lord William Bentinck was the Governor General, and also when Thomas Macaulay was part of this council of on education, that this whole narrative started shifting. And then a lot of people started gathering evidence to show that there was a dire need of reform of Indian education system. And even then the later surveys conducted in Bombay and Punjab and other areas were then presented in a biased manner to show that there was a need for reform. So there was a shift also within the colonial narrative from the early 19th century to the mid and late 19th century.
It's very interesting, and from gathering from what you've said, these surveys are very extensive.
So these are expensive, yes.
Extensive.
Yes, yes.
And
Also, the thing
yeah,
is that they wanted to, include these institutions as part of their administration. So another motivation was that if these institutions are, okay, and then they are not so bad, maybe we can partly reform them and then make it part of the administration and British structures, so that they wanted to understand how they can include that as part of their structure. That's also another motivation that was there.
it sounds as if this was all tied up with the British Raj from the mid 19th century. And as you know, the British were in India for several hundred years before then. And I recall that this is slightly tangential. That there was a guy called William Jones, who
Yes, yes,
was an administrator in a judge in India in the
yes,
18th century, and he said to the British administrators, judges, and lawyers, you must learn Sanskrit
yes,
because you have to read and understand the traditions and the laws by which Indian people uh, live by, and you must read the laws of Manu, which had a knock-on effect because there was a school. In fact, there was a school in England where not very far from London, where in the late 18th century and the 19th century, throughout the 19th century, Sanskrit was on the curriculum with the view to training, of lawyers and judges to go to India and to actually appreciate and understand the background and context of the laws by which. So it's in a way, it's a shame that the Raj manipulated the results of the surveys.
yes,
But at
yes.
least the surveys were done.
Yes, actually, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Actually, that is some credit that we have to give to the British authorities, that at least they were quite rigorous in their work. So they were,
Mm,
and so this was a good mechanism that they had developed to gather information. And in
mm,
fact, it's not just surveys, but also the district gazetteer reports and the gazetteers. I mean that were compiled, that have a lot of information about the districts. And then also, of course, the census reports, although the census itself was, conducted with a certain agenda, but the census reports are also very detailed, the early census reports. So, so that this is, I mean, it has a dual, purpose and a dual aspect. On the one hand, you have you can say like the advantage of having these records is that they have a lot of data and a lot of information that would otherwise not have been recorded or available. On the other hand, these records are themselves biased, so we have to read them with a pinch of salt, and we should know that these records are not fully without any prejudices or without any biases. So it's both sided. I think it's like with a you know
but
like
at least from reading the surveys and what was done with them, you are able to determine that there was bias,
yes,
which is
yes,
obviously important. My next question is this: the Modi government has, through its education department, has instigated what are called IKS, Indian Knowledge Systems,
yes, yes.
over the past 3 or 4 years or so. Um, and how do you see the Indian education system moving forward? Because obviously, right at the moment, it's heavily influenced by Western systems, right? Um, and the the characterization of the education that you described before colonialization um, was, there are characteristics there which are much more in line with the Indian knowledge systems, such as the in mathematics, the mental training,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the development of character. Um, how do you see the education system now in India moving forward with these with this with these different streams of influence?
Yeah, that's a very good question, sir, and thank you for asking this. The introduction of the Indian Knowledge System, IKS, is definitely a welcome step in the road towards decolonization of Indian education. So, when the British colonial intervention happened, it was actually the opposite they introduced English knowledge system or European knowledge system, I would say, and then that superseded the Indian knowledge system. So what happened was that they came up with this principle. This is called principle of religious neutrality. This was a principle of the British colonial period, and this was introduced and made by law. No school or government or institution could include any texts that had anything to do with religion. Now, in Indian texts, there was no separation between religion and secular. So, what happened was that they actually banned all the kinds of texts which had anything to do or any reference at all, with any sort of religious uh, myth or legend. So, as a result, a whole range of Indian texts were outlawed, and which were earlier being taught in the indigenous institutions. And then in European knowledge system was introduced over Indian knowledge system, and as a matter of education policy, starting from 1835 and then 1854 in the Woods Dispatch, and finally in the first Education Commission in 1884, this was made a policy that European knowledge would be given priority over Indian knowledge system. So this was the roadmap of the colonial policy makers. Now, starting with in 2014 onwards, we have tried to do the reverse now. We are going on the roadmap of decolonization, and the first step, one of the first steps, is to have priority given to Indian knowledge system. Now, of course, this cannot be done overnight. We cannot change a system that has been long in place, and we cannot completely overhaul it because it is interlinked with so many different things. So therefore, what they are doing now is they are trying to introduce an IKS or Indian Knowledge System module in every institution, which will be taught alongside the regular teaching curriculum. So, if a student is, let's say, he's doing his undergraduate degree in engineering, be Bachelor of Technology or Engineering, he will have to do his normal regular courses that he's doing, but also have an IKS minor or credits for IKS course that will be counted as part of his education degree. And this is one way in which they have introduced, or I would say revived, Indian knowledge system in the education policy. The other way is that in the new education policy that the government has now come up with in 2020, they introduced this NEP, new education policy, and now they are now revising the textbooks. So the NCRT, which is part of the government Ministry of Education, they are now revising the textbooks, which were last revised, I think, in 1986 or 2000. So it was long back, more than 20 years back. So now they are revising these textbooks. I'm also part of the committee of this textbook development team. And we have already revised the textbooks for from grade 6 to 8th. And now we are in the process of revising from grade 9th onwards up till grade 12. And Indian knowledge system is an integral part of this revision plan. So uh, the government of India is certainly taking important steps towards decolonization of Indian education. And I hope that answers your question, if not
It
completely.
does. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, as part of the NEP, Vedic maths is an easy hit
Yes,
because
yes.
it's well developed, and there are resources available, etc. So I think Vedic maths should be high up on the list. But over and above that, it seems that there are these what might be termed two streams, which are sort of intertwining with each other, where you have Western influenced education, and I've taught in given talks and workshops in many Indian schools, and it's from my experience of teaching in the various high schools in India, it is very Western orientated,
Yes.
and I mean, if I was to sort of give advice about these two streams, I would say, well, fine, just take the best from both and
Yeah.
work with them, because they clearly both have their advantages, and probably both have their disadvantages as well. But there may be a way forward in which they can just the best aspects of both these streams can be merged to make something really successful and useful.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I agree with you. And in fact, I think that is the need of the hour to have a combination or an engagement between both Western knowledge system and Indian knowledge system to bring out the best of both and whatever is relevant for us today, and also in the light of the Indian tradition. So that is, I agree with you. Yeah.
I can't see a way around the non-secular the issue, because that the from my researches, in the Indian culture, there's not a separation between the spiritual and the practical. Whereas in the Western system, yes, there is very much so. I just don't know how you get around that.
Yeah,
Not
that is
easy.
a challenge. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, actually, in that is, so we found in our surveys of the indigenous education system that, for example, I'll just give one example to you. There are many examples like this. For example, we found that when we were undertaking the survey of textbooks and of the texts that were taught in these earlier Pathshalas, we found that the Ramayana and parts of the Ramayana and Mahabharata and excerpts, I mean, particular chapters or episodes or plays were being read in almost all the schools, especially from Ramayana, Mahabharata, and Bhagavad Puran. These three texts were very common, and especially excerpts, because they were a part of the culture, and they were part of plays, of songs, theater, and also of literature that was being read in these schools. So now what happened was that when the British colonial education policy took shape, these were banned and or not recognized by the government, and we still are continuing with that, because whenever we talk about these texts, we have this whole outcry of secular education being violated. So it is a challenge to reintroduce Indian texts, because they are seen from this framework of religion versus secular, which is actually not the framework of Indian texts. They are not religious or secular texts. They are knowledge based texts. So I mean, you can look at a
This
particular.
goes back, yeah, this issue really goes back to when India kicked the British out in 1947, when the political system that was set up was secular, and that makes things tricky.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was, yes, yes. One way is to, is to basically reintroduce Indian knowledge system in a way
Mm.
that it appears secular, and it is, it has to include different aspects. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, stories are the key. Yeah, good stories. Thank you. Well,
Thank you, Ankur. Project, did you want to say something?
Yes. Uh, Hello, Ankur ji. It was a very beautiful talk, and I think you are quite successful in putting this. We are creating lot of interest about your book. I'm very curious and very much nice to know how these pathshalas were there. And I personally know that how it is difficult to reintroduce Indian knowledge system in our curriculum. So, very thank you very much for coming on our platform and delivering this beautiful talk. And actually, both the questions James asked, the second question I was also going to ask you that how difficult it is to reintroduce IKS and challenges, especially in doing textbook. So let's hope that we will return to this Pathshala system again in some way or the other way. And as James suggested, we'll take both of combination of both indigenous as well as best of Western as well, and will create hopefully future Pathshalas in India successfully, which should be skill based and knowledge superpowers. So Thanks. Thank you so much. And thank you all joining this session today. Really very interesting. And we can have many more sessions like this. Thank you. Thank you, Ankurji.